10 years ago, Austria welcomed tens of thousands of migrants with open arms. Today, it's banning headscarves, suspending family reunification, and freezing Syrian asylum claims. What happened? The answer begins in an ordinary classroom in Vienna, where 41% of students are now Muslim, even though Muslims make up only around 8% of Austria's population. To supporters, this is multiculturalism at work. To critics, it's a warning that the country is changing too fast. So why has Austria completely reversed course? To understand how Austria arrived here, return to the summer of 2015 to a railway platform at Vienna's Westbahnhof. Trains pull in from the east, and out of them steps a river of people carrying children, backpacks and papers in languages the conductors cannot read. They have come from Syria, from Afghanistan, from Iraq, up through Greece, Macedonia and Serbia, past Hungary, toward the promise of a safer life inside Europe. Roughly 100,000 of them passed through Austria that year alone. For a small Alpine republic of 9 million at the old crossroads of the continent, it is a human tide unlike anything in living memory. At first, the country answers with a grace the world does not expect. On that same platform, volunteers hand up water, blankets, and cardboard signs that read, "Refugees Welcome." Ordinary Austrians open church halls and spare rooms. The Chancellor of the day speaks of moral duty. For a few luminous weeks, the images out of Austria are images of compassion, a wealthy nation choosing to share its safety with the desperate. But the summer has a darker face, and Austria sees it early. In late August, on a motorway near the eastern border, police pry open the doors of an abandoned refrigerated truck. Inside are 71 people, men, women and children, an infant among them, who suffocated in the sealed compartment while smugglers drove them toward Vienna. A whole nation recoils. It is proof, written in the worst possible ink, that the crisis is not an abstraction of politics, but a matter of life and death on Austrian soil. By year's end, Austria has registered around 90,000 asylum applications. Against its population, that is one of the heaviest loads carried anywhere in Europe. More asylum claims in a single year than the country records births. The machinery of the state buckles. Reception centres overflow, tents rise in the autumn cold, and at the great processing camp of Traiskirchen, south of Vienna, human rights monitors walk the corridors and call the conditions unfit for the people it is meant to shelter. In border towns like Nikolsdorf, where the migrants first cross from Hungary, a few thousand residents wake to find themselves the front line of a continental emergency. The questions that felt distant in summer now press in from every side. Where will these people live? Who will pay? How many more are coming? And beneath them all, the question politicians hesitate to speak aloud. Can a country of 9 million absorb a population this large, this fast, from cultures this different, without becoming something it never chose to be? Then the mood turns with the season. The welcome signs come down. On New Year's Eve, reports of mass assaults by groups of migrant men in the German city of Cologne cross the border and poison the well of public trust. The government that opened the doors begins, quietly, to feel for the locks. It caps asylum claims. It posts soldiers and police to the mountain passes and the southern crossings. It helps stitch together the diplomatic coalition that will finally close the Balkan route for good. The country that improvised compassion in the summer of 2015 spends the winter learning to say no. To grasp why the reversal cuts so deep, you have to know what Austria believes about itself.
This is a nation with a long and physical memory of the frontier. Twice, in 1529 and again in 1683, Ottoman armies reached the walls of Vienna, and twice the city held. Austrian children still learn those sieges as the hinge on which the fate of Central Europe turned. For centuries, the country pictured itself as the eastern edge of one civilization, standing watch against another, and that self-image never wholly faded. So when hundreds of thousands of Muslims arrived in the span of a few years, the argument that followed was never only about housing, jobs, or paperwork. It was about identity.
It was about whether the country at the old gate could remain itself. The numbers gave that anxiety a shape. Islam has been a recognized religion in Austria since 1912, a legacy of the empire that once ruled Bosnia, and for generations the Muslim community, largely Turkish and Bosnian, ranked among the most quietly integrated in Europe. But the scale had changed. By the early 2020s, Muslims made up more than 8% of the population, some 700,000 people, and rising, gathered in the cities and, above all, in Vienna. In the capital's classrooms, the shift was starkest of all. Surveys would soon find more than 4 in 10 schoolchildren identifying as Muslim. And a statistic about the distant future became something parents could see every morning at the school gate. None of this, on its own, decided what Austria would do next.
Plenty of countries took in large numbers in 2015 and reached very different conclusions. But the crisis planted 2 convictions that would harden across the decade. The first, that the state had lost control of its own borders, and control, once surrendered, would have to be seized back by force of law. The second was more delicate and more combustible, that integration was not automatic, that some of the newcomers came from societies whose assumptions about faith, gender, and public life sat uneasily beside Austrian norms, and that pretending otherwise was its own kind of denial. From those 2 convictions, law by law, over the next 10 years, Austria would build a policy so hard that the welcoming country of 2015 became almost unrecognizable. The rebuilding of Austria's defences began not at the border, but at the mosque. Even as the crisis crested, in 2015, the parliament reopened the country's century-old law on Islam and rewrote it. The reform cut off foreign funding for mosques and imams. It required imams to preach in German. It demanded German translations of religious texts, and it handed the state the power to dissolve any congregation it judged unregistered or hostile to Austrian values. To its architects, it was a template for a homegrown European Islam, loyal to the Republic and not to foreign capitals. To much of the Muslim community, it was discrimination dressed as integration, a law that treated ordinary believers as a security file. The man who pushed it through was a young foreign minister named Sebastian Kurz, and the fight would make his career. Kurz had grasped the central fact of Austrian politics for the coming decade. The anxiety unleashed in 2015 was not going away, and whoever spoke to it most convincingly would rule. By 2017, he was chancellor, his party remade around a hard line on migration. In 2018, he put the Islam law to work. His government announced the closure of 7 mosques and moved to expel dozens of foreign-funded imams. It dissolved an Arab religious association running a cluster of Vienna mosques and shut a Turkish nationalist congregation. To the state, it was a blow against political Islam and foreign influence. To its critics, it was a government sorting houses of worship into the permitted and the forbidden. The campaign against political Islam soon grew institutions of its own. In 2020, the government stood up a documentation center for political Islam, a state-funded body charged with charting the networks, associations, and money flows of Islamist movements inside the country. Beside it appeared a contested Islam map, an online atlas that pinned hundreds of mosques and Muslim organizations to their exact addresses.
Officials called it transparency. Muslim leaders called it a target list and warned it left ordinary community centers exposed to harassment. That same autumn, in a dawn sweep codenamed Operation Luxor, hundreds of officers searched dozens of homes and offices across Austria, hunting alleged ties to the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas. It was among the largest such operations in the country's history. Yet many of those dragged from their beds were never charged, and critics said an entire community had been placed under suspicion. The line between watching extremism and watching a faith had never looked thinner, and the tension along it runs through everything Austria has done since. Meanwhile, migration itself was changing character, and the statistics told a story no politician could ignore. Those arriving to claim asylum came overwhelmingly from a short list of Muslim-majority countries.
By 2024, the largest group by far was Syrian, more than half of all claims, trailed by Afghans and then citizens of Turkey. However one felt about it, the pattern was plain. The people entering through the asylum system were, in their great majority, from the very cultures the integration debate was about. For those convinced the country was changing too fast, here was the engine of that change, printed in the annual figures. Then came the earthquake. On the 29th of September 2024, Austrians went to the polls and for the first time since the Second World War, handed first place to the far-right Freedom Party. Its leader, Herbert Kickl, was a combative populist who had himself been the interior minister behind the mosque closures. His party took nearly 29% on a blunt promise: halt asylum, police Islam, and pursue what it called remigration, the mass return of migrants to their countries of origin. The movement that had spent decades on the fringe was now the single largest force in Austrian politics, and every rival had to reckon with the message its voters had sent. That reckoning was still unfolding when the Middle East forced Austria's hand. In December 2024, the regime of Bashar al-Assad collapsed, and a war that had driven millions into exile ended, suddenly and chaotically. Within days, Austria's Interior Ministry suspended every asylum procedure for Syrian nationals and began drawing up plans for return. The logic struck many as simple, even irresistible. If the danger people had fled was gone, then the protection granted against it could be reconsidered. The government even dangled a payment, around €1,000, to any Syrian willing to leave voluntarily. After 9 years, the country was no longer asking only how to take people in. It was asking, out loud, how to send them back. Every step had its own justification, and defenders of the policy insist the thread binding them is not prejudice, but sovereignty, the plain right of a democracy to decide who enters, who stays, and on what terms. Yet lay them side by side, the Islam law, the shuttered mosques, the documentation center, the shifting asylum numbers, the Freedom Party's rise, the Syrian freeze, and the trajectory is unmistakable. In a single decade, Austria moved from managing a crisis to re-engineering its whole relationship with migration and with Islam. What began as an emergency answer to one extraordinary summer had become a standing national project.
And the hardest measures, the ones that would test how far a liberal democracy was willing to go, were still ahead, waiting for a new government that would somehow have to answer the voters of 2024 without handing power to the party those voters had chosen. The government that finally formed in March 2025 was, on paper, a rebuke to the election. Rather than let the Freedom Party lead, three rivals, the Conservative People's Party, the Social Democrats, and the Liberal Neos, set aside decades of quarrel and built the first three-way coalition Austria had seen since 1949. Christian Stocker took the chancellery. Gerhard Kahner, the hardline interior minister who had run the crackdown of the previous years, kept his desk, a signal that on migration there would be no softening. The far-right winner was shut out of power.
But the parties that shut Kickle out had read the same returns he had, and they knew that to deny him office while ignoring his voters would only feed him. So the centrist coalition governed, in one decisive respect, exactly as the far right had campaigned. Its program promised the strictest asylum regime in the country's history. The measures came fast. In the spring of 2025, the government suspended family reunification for people already granted protection, the legal channel by which a refugee in Austria could bring a spouse or a child to safety. It justified the freeze by declaring a state of emergency for public order, arguing that schools, housing, and social services could no longer take the strain. Human rights groups went to court, warning the suspension collided with European law and with the basic right to a family life.
But the effect on the ground was immediate, and it was stark. In October of 2024, 384 people entered Austria through family reunification. In the same month, a year later, after the freeze, the number was 9. Then the government reached into the classroom. It moved to ban the headscarf for girls under 14 across all Austrian schools, a measure expected to touch as many as 12,000 children. This was not the first attempt. A narrower ban for girls under 10 had passed in 2019 and been struck down by the Constitutional Court, which ruled that singling out a single religion breached the principle of equality. This time, the law was drafted with more care and sold not as an attack on Islam, but as a defense of the child, a shield against what ministers called the sexualization and subordination of young girls. To its supporters, the state was protecting the vulnerable. To its opponents, politicians were deciding what a Muslim family could teach its own daughters and writing a law that would drive devout families out of public schools rather than draw them in. Abroad, Austria began doing what had once been unthinkable. In 2025, it carried out its first forced removal to Syria since 2011, probing the legal and moral limits of returning people to a country only months out of civil war. And yet, for all the noise, the great reversal struck a stubborn wall of reality. Of the roughly 100,000 Syrians living in Austria, only about 2% left, even after losing their asylum status and being offered money to go. Many had been in the country for years. Their children were Austrian in everything but the paperwork. They spoke German, sat in Austrian classrooms, and had no other home to return to. A state can rewrite a law in an afternoon. It cannot so easily rewrite the facts of a life already built. Remigration, sold as a solution, ran straight into the limits of a democracy bound by its own courts and its own conscience. Here is the paradox at the heart of the clampdown. The country that once stood at the gate now finds the newcomers are no longer at the gate at all. They are inside, in the schools, the hospitals, the workforce, threaded through the fabric of the nation. The fight over the headscarf and the asylum freeze is, at bottom, a fight about a transformation that has, in large part, already happened. In Vienna, where more than 4 in 10 schoolchildren are Muslim, while the country as a whole holds near 8%, 2 futures sit side by side in the same classroom. In one, difference dissolves into a shared Austrian identity. In the other, it hardens into a permanent divide. And there is a cost the government mentions far less often.
In 2024, a European survey found that 71% of Muslims in Austria had experienced racism in their daily lives, far above the European average of 47%. Every law aimed at political Islam, every map of mosques, every argument over a headscarf also lands on hundreds of thousands of ordinary citizens who were born in Austria, pay Austrian taxes, and ask for nothing more than to belong. A policy meant to defend social cohesion risks eating away at it from the other side, teaching a generation of young Muslims that however fluent their German, however Austrian their lives, they will be seen first as a problem to be managed. So why has Austria reversed course? Because a small nation with a long memory of the frontier looked at one extraordinary decade, the tide of 2015, the truck on the motorway, the changing classrooms, the rising far right, and decided the pace of change had outrun its consent.
Whether that is wisdom or fear may depend on where you stand and on what the country does next. For Austria now faces the oldest question a nation at the gate can ask, and the hardest. Not only whom to keep out, but whom, among those already inside, it is willing to call its own. The walls of Vienna held twice before. This time the challenge is not at the walls. It is in the heart of the country, and no fence that was ever built can answer it.